Hi everybody, Dana Sparks, broker of Maximum One Greater Atlanta Realtors, and today's contract tip has to do with the inspection report. For a seller, do you want it and may you share it? So I have been asked lately several questions from listing agents on the inspection report. If you represent a seller and there is a buyer that has the property under contract and they have an independent home inspection done on the property and there is a report done, if they terminate the contract within their due diligence period, the listing agents have been asking if they have already received a copy of the inspection report, may they share that report with a new buyer? And I had one listing agent ask me, the contract terminated within due diligence. I never received a copy, the seller never received a copy of the inspection report. May I get it from the buyer that terminated? So those are the two issues we are talking about today. So let's deal with the first question about sharing it first. So if you are a seller and you have had the property under contract, a buyer has had an independent home inspection done, they have sent you the inspection report and they have terminated within their due diligence period. The seller is now in possession of that report. The seller goes under contract with buyer number two. Buyer number two asks for a copy of the previous inspection. What are the responsibilities, or may the seller share that report with buyer number two, or should they? So a couple of things to consider. Number one, agent, it is not your report. It is now the seller's report. The buyer number one has purchased it, but since they shared it with the seller, it now belongs to the seller as well because buyer number one gave it to the seller. So it would be up to the seller to choose if they wanted to share that report with buyer number two or not. So again, that's not an agent call, that is a seller call, and I would definitely get that permission in writing if a seller does choose to share a previous inspection report that was purchased by one buyer and share it with a new buyer. Now, the pros and cons of doing that would depend on what's in the inspection report, who the inspection was performed by. Was it a company? Was the inspector? There's no licensing for home inspectors here in Georgia, but there are certifications. So was that inspector certified? What were their certifications? And what was in that report? So a seller is by no means obligated to share an inspection report that they are in possession of with a new buyer, but they may share it. Again, that is a seller call, not an agent call, but there needs to be a discussion regarding the pros and cons of sharing that report with a new buyer. So that's the first question. The second question is, we had a listing agent a seller who there was a buyer, they had an independent home inspection, buyer terminated within the due diligence time frame. The seller wants a copy of the inspection report. So I want to just have a brief discussion with you about, does the seller really want that report or not? Now, first of all, we have to remember that a buyer's due diligence period is the seller, the due diligence period in a contract is the seller granting the buyer the option to terminate the contract for any or no reason. So if a buyer does have an inspection done and then terminates a contract within their due diligence, it doesn't necessarily mean that the buyer terminated the contract based on something that came up in the inspection. The buyer could have terminated the contract because they found out their financing isn't going to go through, because they found out the property isn't in the school district that they like, because they found out the zoning of the street and the property is not what they thought it was, because they found out that the commute to work is way too long, because they changed their mind and found another house they like better, because they don't like the something about the neighborhood or the area or the shopping or the restaurants or whatever. It doesn't matter. A buyer is entitled to terminate a contract, has the right to terminate a contract within their due diligence period for any or no reason, and they do not need to give the seller a reason. So again, just because a buyer has spent money on an inspection and they terminate, it doesn't necessarily mean that there were issues with the inspection that caused the buyer to terminate the contract. So that being said, should a seller ask for it? Well, a seller may always ask for an inspection report from a buyer. The buyer is by no means obligated to give the seller the inspection report, whether we're talking about a deal that terminates or a deal that has not terminated and is a transaction that is going to go to closing. She scared me. The inspection was purchased by the buyer, and the report therefore belongs to the buyer. So it is completely up to the buyer whether the buyer wants to share that report with a seller, as I mentioned, either if they are continuing on with the transaction or if they are choosing to terminate the transaction. So if a seller does decide they do want a copy of that inspection report, they may ask for it, but a buyer is by no means obligated to send them that report. So then that begs the question, does the seller even want a copy of the inspection report? So one issue would be, yes, the seller would perhaps want to see what came across on an inspection report. But again, those issues I just talked about. Who was the inspection company? Who was the inspector? What were the conditions of the day during the inspection? Was the inspector certified? So forth and so on. Now, once a seller is in possession of an inspection report, if it is from a company that is a company to do an inspection company here in Georgia that is certified by one or more of the various inspector type certifications, then the seller needs to revise their seller's property disclosure statement. So the GAR property disclosure statement, which is GAR F301, states instructions to the seller in completing the statement. In completing the statement, the seller agrees to answer all the questions in reference to the property and the improvements, answer all questions fully and accurately to the actual knowledge and belief of all sellers, provide additional explanations for yes, promptly revise the statement if there are any material changes in the answers to any of the questions prior to closing, and provide a copy of the same, meaning the revised property disclosure, to any buyer and broker involved in the transaction. So once a seller is in possession of an inspection report from a certified inspector, and again, that could be argued either way, the buyer must revise the seller's property disclosure statement and update it and give it to a new buyer. So again, if a seller isn't in possession of the report and doesn't know what's on there, then there isn't necessarily anything to revise unless the seller does have specific knowledge about a material change with respect to the property. On the same hand, the instructions are very similar on the RE form, Seller's Property Condition Disclosure Statement, which is RE 130. And it says purposes of statement and disclaimer. Again, this Seller's Property Disclosure Statement is intended to, it pertains to certain conditions and information concerning the property that are known to the seller. It goes on to say, it says it is not a substitute for any inspections. In no event shall the parties hold the seller's broker liable for any representations not directly made by the broker or broker's agents. And it does go on to say that any changes, known changes to the property that are known by the seller, that report, that disclosure statement does need to be revised and sent to any potential buyers. So just a few thoughts to consider regarding an inspection report on a property. And number one, does the seller want a copy of it? And if the seller is in possession of a copy of it, may the seller share that with another buyer. Thank you so much for watching. I hope this contract tip helped you out. Dana Sparks, broker of Maximum One Greater Atlanta Realtors, satisfying your needs with service, innovation, and education.